Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everyone for joining me on another episode as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics from Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 as we gear up for the release of Avowed. As usual, for those of you who aren't aware why we're pairing Pillars of Eternity and Avowed together, it's because they share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. And so as the theory goes, as we gear up for the release of Avowed, we can look into the Pillars of Eternity games to glean some insights into how Avowed might develop, what kind of stories we might see, and just learn a little bit about the world so we can walk into it with an even knowledge base and appreciate all the nuances and narratives that Obsidian is sure to put into the game. In gearing up for the June 11 Xbox Games Showcase, I am attempting to get all the big ticket lore topics out of the way because you never know. There might be a chance there's something of Avowed at the Xbox Games Showcase. I'm trying not to snuff as much hopium as humanly possible, but it's human. You can't help yourself sometimes, right? So just in case, I want to get some of these big ticket items out of the way that we haven't talked about yet. And I feel kind of embarrassed that we haven't talked about all these topics in the last few episodes at this point, considering we're like nearly 60 episodes in, but whatever, it is what it is, and here we are. So today, we're going to be talking about one of the races of the world of Eora, and that is the Dwarves. Now, I'm sure a lot of you listening, even if you haven't played Pillars of Eternity, you're familiar with what a dwarf is from popular fantasy novels and movies and video games, and so you've seen them before. Eora's dwarves are the same but also different from a lot of those typical fantasy settings. They are stout and short, and they can have their own particular attitude and all that, but the Dwarves of Eora do have their own unique spin in terms of what their natural instincts are, what their history in the world is like, how other people view them, and we're going to dive into a few of those ideas today. So join me as we discuss Dwarves in Eora.
I'm curious, what exactly did you find there?
So dwarves in Eora tend to be a lot like other dwarves we see in other fantasy settings. So if you've watched the Lord of the Rings series or you've played any other fantasy games that feature dwarves in them, they have the same physiological traits of being short, stout, usually well-bearded, and having kind of a clan society and all that kind of thing. Those typical dwarven aspects are still present in the Dwarves of Eora, as seen in Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2. They're described in the game as being short and thick-limbed. They tend to be extremely sturdy and durable, often attributed to spending millennia living in rocky environments more suited to goats than people. Their natural lifespan is typically between 110 and 90 years. And so this is kind of typical things that we see. Usually when we see dwarves and other things, even like Dungeons & Dragons, they live longer than humans. They tend to live in mountainous or rocky areas, oftentimes even carving cities right into the mountain itself. I don't remember any specific examples of that happening within the world of Eora, but I'm sure it has, or it could have. Sturdy and durable, all that kind of stuff, that's pretty typical. If you're looking at the statistics of them, they have a +2 to might, a +1 to constitution, and a -1 to dexterity, which is to say they're pretty strong, they got hardy bodies, but they're not super agile or graceful, which I think, in my experience anyway, of dwarves and other fantasy settings, that's kind of typical to what dwarves are like. Where the dwarves differ, however, is in their natural proclivity towards exploration and settling. So I'm going to read directly from the Pillars of Eternity Guidebook Volume 1 in the Peoples and Cultures section, page 40. And this kind of describes their natural proclivity towards traveling. Most historians believe dwarves originated somewhere in the southern hemisphere and have spread rapidly in waves over thousands of years, almost always via land travel. Many dwarf-heavy cultures are noted for being among the most aggressive terrestrial colonists in the world. However, these colonial expeditions fail more often than they succeed, and dwarven colonial ruins are scattered across the known world. See, while we've discussed the Amauans before and how the Rauatayan Navy is very, very explorative and they've gone all over the world and you can see them pretty much in every corner of the map, the thing about dwarves is they probably explore more of Eora than the Amauans do. However, they don't always succeed necessarily at staying in one location. This is more true of the mountain dwarves than the boreal dwarves, which are the two kind of main sub-races of the dwarven race within this game world. But as you can see, there's a lot of interest in terms of where did the dwarves originally originate from, and the game lore itself isn't even consistent. I think that is how much Obsidian Entertainment meant for the dwarves, specifically mountain dwarves, to be moving around and exploring the world. Their race, their people, is so explorative naturally on an instinctual level that it seems like the lore itself isn't even necessarily consistent. It is still consistent. I'll tell you what I mean. In the Pillars of Eternity fandom website, if you go to the mountain dwarf area, you can get an in-game description from Pillars of Eternity 1 and Pillars of Eternity 2 in the official in-game encyclopedia. This is the encyclopedia entry that you will read from mountain dwarves from both games, and you'll note a difference at the beginning of each of these passages. So this first one is from Pillars of Eternity 1, and it says, mountain dwarves originated on the continent to the east of the Dyrwood and have spread through the area several times. The Dyrwood is the main setting for the first Pillars of Eternity game. Unlike the similarly diminutive Orlans, which is another race of the world, who are frequently subjugated, the mountain dwarves have always directly fought back threats posed by larger kith and opted to fortify their residences rather than move on. Mountain dwarves are common in the Vailian Republics, another location on the same continent as the Dyrwood, but not seen as often in the Dyrwood and Rayed Saris. Rayed Saris is another colony that's in the same continent as Dyrwood and Vailian Republics. So the important part of that is more mountain dwarves originated on the continent to the east of the Dyrwood. And we'll learn this later, but that's an area known as the White March, which is a mountain range that they're particularly noted to have been in. Now, if you move over to the second game and you read the in-game encyclopedia, you see this. Mountain dwarves originated on the continent of Aedir in the old empires, but had disappeared from those lands long before humans and elves arrived there. They have spread rapidly throughout the world over the millennia due to their instinctive drive to explore and migrate. While mountain dwarves do form settlements and even small nations, they are more often found within other cultures, most commonly Old Valia, the Vailian Republics, and the Dyrwood. And so in that second paragraph, we learn that officially, rather than the lore, the mountain dwarves do like to get around. They like to travel. They like to expand. They like to see things, but they don't always end up settling their own nations. They just like to see the world, and then they end up kind of falling into the cultures that exist in the area. But the thing that I want to point out is that it says mountain dwarves originated on the continent of Aedir in the old empires. But in the previous game's encyclopedia, it said mountain dwarves originated on the continent to the east of the Dyrwood, which I already told you is the White March. And so between these two games, we have this kind of differing statement on where they originated from. Now, to be fair, I think the second Pillars game is referencing to where mountain dwarves might have originally hailed from far before they were found within the White March themselves. And then the first game is describing primarily where a lot of mountain dwarves had settled and kind of set up their major city, if you will. So that's probably the discrepancy there. But the idea behind this is that the mountain dwarves especially, they get around. They explore the world and they check everything out. And we don't even know necessarily where they originally started from. There is an idea, obviously, that they came out of Aedir before the regular Aedirans were there, before they actually formed the nation of Aedir. And this is a continent that is completely separate from the Dyrwood, by the way. And so you might wonder yourself, why don't we see a lot of dwarven settlements and cities and nations? Is it just because that's just not their thing, or what is it? And I think it's because they don't necessarily have, I would say, A, good luck, or B, I guess, good decision making. If you skip ahead later in the Pillars of Eternity 1 guidebook, we can read about early dwarven settlements there. This section of the lore starts off by saying, the history of dwarven settlement is fraught with trial and error. Punctuated by surges of uncontrolled enthusiasm for development, it seems intrinsic to the nature of dwarves that they look beyond their borders and imagine wonders on the far side. The dwarven kingdom of White March was located northeast of Erglonfath, which is an area within the first Pillars of Eternity game. Compromising largely Vailian colonists, the area, that is the White March, prospered because of the notorious steel forges at Durgan's Battery. Durgan's Battery is basically the name of a dwarven citadel, and they made a really high-quality steel there called Durgan Steel. Durgan steel is renowned worldwide as the best of its craft, and to this day remains highly valued by collectors and adventurers for its rarity and durability. And so that's just a little bit of like what the White March is. If you have Pillars of Eternity 1 and you get the expansion packs, the White March Part 1 and the White March Part 2, you actually get to go and find Durgan's battery, and you get to engage with some narratives over there. But suffice it to say that at some point, a bunch of mountain dwarves had basically set up shop in this White March area, which is a bunch of mountain ranges in the Eastern Reach continent, and they had this citadel called Durgan's Battery. But as a very good example of what happens to the dwarves when they try to explore and settle, we have this story to talk about. When the dwarves of White March pushed their colonies deeper into the eastern continent, they overextended the limits of their reach. An aggressive ogre population led a war party against their settlement, which forced the dwarves back in dwindling numbers. Spurred by bloodlust, the band of ogres tracked the refugees and fought their way into the dwarven territory, conquering the once mighty citadel of Durgan's Battery. And so this just serves as an example of like what happens with the dwarves. The dwarves have such a huge wanderlust that they end up shooting themselves in the foot when it comes to settling down. Because they settle down, they start building up a city or a citadel or whatever it is, but in no time at all, they're already looking to their borders thinking, how much further can we go? And they spread themselves out so thin that they don't have the population in one area to be able to set up their own nation. And as a result, they either get driven out by the locals or the local wildlife or, ogres or something like that, or they just assimilate into the cultures that are in the area. And this failure of dwarven settlements is an explanation for why dwarves are so evenly scattered around the world. And this is something you might not have noticed because when you play a game, you just tend to play the game, right? You don't tend to sit around and read every little bit of lore, and you might not ask yourself, why are there humans in this area? Why are there elves in this area? And why are there dwarves absolutely everywhere? And if that's not a question you don't ask, I don't blame you. I never really asked it before this episode either, but when you sit down and think about it, yeah, the humans of certain cultures have explanations for where they came from. Same with the elves, the Amauans, the Orlans. There's a history to each of these races. But dwarves, we see everywhere. The dwarves are just in every culture, and this is the explanation for why they essentially just cannot stop exploring. And I like how this lore also plays into the mechanics of the game. Like, for example, if you choose to be a mountain dwarf in Pillars of Eternity 1, you get this racial ability called Hale and Hardy, which gives you plus 20 defense against poison and disease. And the justification, and this is actually written down in the strategy guide for Pillars of Eternity, says mountain dwarves are the most well-traveled race in Eora. Their incredible journeys have exposed them to all manner of lethal poisons and horrific diseases. As a result, all living mountain dwarves have a strong resistance to both. I just love how Obsidian does that. They could just say, mountain dwarves, they're good against poison and disease. Why? Because they said so. Okay, moving on. But they don't do that, right? And honestly, they could even just say because they're dwarves. That's just what they do. But they say, no, because the dwarves are well-traveled, they have exposure to these things, therefore they've built up an immunity to it. And I love that Obsidian does that. Before we move on to talking about the boreal dwarves, I'm just going to quickly give a physical description of what mountain dwarves look like, and then we can compare the two. So mountain dwarves, which by the way are called aptapo, that's aptapo, and that comes from the Valian word aptapalar, which means goat people. So it's actually kind of a pejorative word. It's not necessarily the best word out there to describe mountain dwarves. It's basically just calling them goat people, but that's what they're called, aptapo. They are broad-bridged, strong noses, broad, square, inverted triangle, or inverted heart-shaped faces, broad jaws and necks, almond or thin eyes, deep-set eyes, very prominent brows. The word broad happens 3 times in that one little section. They have fair to dark brown, tough and leathery skin, often creased even amongst the young. Their hair is blonde, strawberry blonde, red, auburn, brown, and black, wavy, curly, or kinky. And lastly, their eyes are usually green, hazel, gold, gray, brown, or black. The reason I include this is just, a little bit of narrative flair. If any of you out there are playing tabletop role-playing games, if these features of the physiology is important to your game, then feel free to take that information, do with it what you will. So we talked about the mountain dwarves at length already, but I want to stop and talk about the other kind of dwarves out there, the boreal dwarves, or as they're known in their native language, Anutanik, which means people of the tundra. These dwarves are not as, we'll call it, well-traveled as the mountain dwarves, as the Aptapo, but, they do still have that natural dwarven proclivity. And when you run into Sagani in the first Pillars of Eternity game, who is a boreal dwarf that has traveled to the Dyrwood in the first Pillars game, you kind of get that sense of like where she's from and where she is now, and you learn the reasons of why she's there, and it's kind of like that's a lot of traveling to just justify doing. And I think that's because dwarves just naturally are a lot more okay and comfortable with traveling. And also maybe has something to do with the times, and also because it's just cool narrative stuff, right? So boreal dwarves mostly live in the remote southern island of Nasitak, where they share the rocky tundra and snow-covered forest with migratory pale elves and the coast-hugging shifts of the Amawa. So if you've played the Pillars of Eternity games at all, you might have heard about the Deadfire Archipelago, which is the main setting for the second Pillars of Eternity game. As well, you might have heard about the White That Wins, which is essentially the Antarctica of this world, except a little more habitable, and that's where all the pale elves of this world live. And Nasitak is this massive island, or at least I would consider it to be massive, considering it's got entire cultures living on it, this island nation of Nasitak. And Nasitak is an interesting enough culture on its own that we can do an episode, maybe a bonus episode about, but this is where the boreal dwarves come from. And they do still have the natural proclivity to explore, obviously. I think the difference, though, between the mountain dwarves and the boreal dwarves is that they have managed to, in this island nation of Nasitak, find their own settlement and find their own nation. And so this is a place where dwarves are the main population, and they start here as a home base, and they use this as a way to explore the rest of the world. And that is one of the major differences between mountain dwarves, the Aptapo, and the boreal dwarves, the Anutanik, is that the Anutanik have set up their own nation, their own culture, and they explore from there, whereas mountain dwarves tend to just go all over the place, and they end up becoming just part of the culture they're in, rather than having their own distinct one, a lot like these boreal dwarves do. Physiologically, they are a little bit different as well. The boreal dwarves have moderately wide, flat noses, broad, flat, round faces, almond, downturned, or thin eyes with epicanthic folds, shallow, set eyes, non-prominent brows. So in just this first little section of their physiology, there are some differences. I don't expect you necessarily to remember them all. I'm not going to repeat both of them twice now because that would just be boring content. But if you were to go listen back, you would hear differences. The word broad, for one, is not mentioned nearly as much. Their face shape is different, and the setness of their eyes, like how deep they are under their skull, is different. So there is a difference between these dwarves, which means there is a long enough history between these dwarven races, or these sub-races, that they have, I guess you could call it, evolutionary differences. Their skin is tan to dark tan, tough and leathery, and often creased even amongst the young, which is the same as the mountain dwarves. Hair is auburn, brown, black-gray, straight and thin. Their eyes are hazel, brown, gold, copper, deep violet, and black. I like those last two, a deep violet eye or a black eye. That's so cool. That's fantasy-ass fantasy right there. I love that. The Anutanik culture is a very interesting one. As I said, we can talk about that when we go into a description of Nasitak. As a quick description of what it is, like I said, it's basically a nation that's shoved between the Deadfire Archipelago and the White That Wins. So even though they are their own nation, one of their major defining features is that they're between these two more major areas. It is a rocky tundra area and often snow-covered with forests and far-roaming caravan elves who drift near the shoreline. It is regarded, however, as the biggest and most stable nation around. I imagine because it's not a place that a lot of people are trying to go and invade and plunder all the resources of. Maybe it's not that big, maybe there's just not a lot there. Who knows? It is definitely a hardy place to live, and a lot of the boreal dwarves adopt this tribal culture, and they have kind of a hunter-gatherer to them, which you learn a lot from Sagani in the first game. And just like the mountain dwarves, they do have their own racial ability, which is justified again by the lore. They have what's called hunter's instincts, which basically means you get plus 15 accuracy against a certain type of enemy as well as another. And the reason being is that in the traditional lands of the boreal dwarves, primordial creatures such as oozes, sentient fungi, and plants, and wilder creatures like ogres, skulders, trolls, vithraks, and zarups have long preyed on isolated hunters. Generations of conflict with these creatures has given the boreal dwarves inherent accuracy bonuses against them. And again, I love seeing that kind of stuff as a lore nerd myself, as someone who really likes to read the books in the game and like ask deep questions about what's going on in the stories. I love seeing a racial ability tied to a subrace of a character that you build, and the lore gives you a reason for why you have that. Because you could just say, well, because they're a hunter culture, so they're good hunters. But it's like, they didn't have to mention the primordial creatures. They didn't have to mention their conflict with them, but they did. And Obsidian, thank you for that. I love that you guys do this kind of stuff. So that is the mountain and boreal dwarves of the world of Eora as seen in Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2. Now, the question is, now that we've seen what they're like in Pillars of Eternity, what might dwarves have to do with Avowed?
Is an oath worth the weight of a crown?
I suppose the first and most obvious way that dwarves will be involved in Avowed is that you as a player character might be able to play as one. And depending on how much roleplay is involved, you can now take the information from this episode and bring that into your roleplay. So as a dwarf, particularly a mountain or a boreal dwarf, you might get certain abilities. You might be able to take on particular creatures in a better way. You'll be more effective. You might have a more hardy and tough body because of all the exposure your ancestors had to poisons and disease. Basically, you might be a dwarf. And that might matter because dwarves are a little bit smaller. Maybe there'll be some unique opportunities in quests to utilize your small stature to complete the quest in a different way. Obviously, because they are a little more sturdy, they have a higher constitution, that might change the way you build your character if we get to select our class in the game. It really depends on how Avowed is setting up its character creation, whether or not we get class selection or how we build our characters and what they're going to be like. And in terms of roleplay, we have this information of like they're well-traveled. And they like to go to other places of the world. Even if you're a boreal dwarf, you can say, my homeland is Nasitak, but they still like to explore. And that matters as well. It means if you're playing a boreal dwarf in the game, you might run into other boreal dwarves, and you might be able to have unique dialogue opportunities with them because you share the same home. Or if you are a mountain dwarf, you'll run into a lot of other mountain dwarves. You might not necessarily have the same brotherhood because you don't have the same home, but who knows? Maybe you might be able to talk one into getting you some Durgan steel, which is going to be the most high quality steel you can get for your weapons and armor. Which leads me into saying that second half of how dwarves will be involved in Avowed is basically that they will probably be there in form of NPCs. So it's not just you that might be a dwarf. There will almost certainly be other dwarves running around that you can engage and talk with. And having this knowledge about behind the scenes about why dwarves are the way they are, where they come from, if we can even figure out where they came from, that'll add a little bit of flair to your experience of the narratives within Avowed. The last way that dwarves could be involved in Avowed, by my understanding, is that we might run into a lot of dwarven ruins. Because as it said in the lore, the mountain dwarves, they kind of went everywhere, and they tried to settle down, they built cities, but they never really succeeded at it, and so all their cities just got left abandoned. And so dwarven ruins are something that could be very common. They're not as, I would say, esoteric and mysterious and enigmatic as in Gwithan ruins, but they're still out there. And so dwarven ruins might serve as kind of like minor dungeons or just like quick little camps to plunder loot from. Who knows what the Obsidian developers are going to want to do with it, but they could use multiple dwarven ruins as things to do out in the open world or the regional map world of Avowed, depending on how they decide to build it. Those are the primary ways I see the dwarven race being involved in Avowed. They're pretty obvious, except for maybe the dwarven ruins part. And that part on the last end is just a little hopeful for how they might design the world itself. But that is it for today's episode. Thank you everyone for listening. I know this one might be a little shorter than you were hoping for, but thank you all for listening. It was really fun getting into the lore for dwarves, and it's actually made me really consider whether or not my first character will be a dwarf. Have any of you out there considered what your first Avowed character is going to be? I'd be interested in hearing it. Send me an email at worldofeora@gmail.com. Let me know what you think. As well, if you have any questions about today's episode or criticisms or extra lore that you want to offer, send me an email and I can read it on the show. I love to share this kind of stuff with people. If you want to follow me on Twitter at World of Eora, I post updates about the show and anything else that's going on. Recently, I started doing more weekly episodes. I still plan on doing short episodes. I'm just kind of busting out as many mainline large ones as I can in a row before the June 11th Xbox Game Showcase, just in case there's something of Avowed. Don't get too excited. Don't let me doing this get you too excited. I have no idea if Avowed will be there or not. I'm just bracing myself just in case. But that's it for today's episode. Nothing else to give in terms of news for the show or for the games. As for what I've been playing lately, I've finally finished playing Redfall. I didn't finish the game. I just finished the first major section. And I know this might be considered a gamer sin, but I enjoyed it. I thought it was fun. I liked the gunplay. I enjoyed the characters. And a lot of the issues didn't really bother me. Yeah, things were clipping in and out of each other, and it was obviously not optimized to the best of its ability, and it wasn't up to the standards I think most other Arcane games have. But when I asked myself if I was having fun, I was having fun. Like, it was fun to shoot vamps in the face. The quests were pretty straightforward. For me, it was just a game I think I needed at that point in time. And while, yeah, there were issues, it was still fun. And so, I don't know. Abandon my show now if you heard me say that, if you will. But I enjoyed Redfall. I don't think that it was a technically wonderful game, obviously. But as far as fun factor goes, it was a good time for me. But what I'm excited for is Legend of Zelda, which at the time of this recording, it's coming out tomorrow, and I am so excited. I've had it pre-ordered. I cannot wait to get my hands on that. I'll be playing it at work all the time and at home all the time. I'll probably have to say goodbye to my wife and child because I'm just going to disappear into the aether. But that's what's going on with me. Let me know what you guys are playing as well. worldofeora@gmail.com. Include that with what your first character in Avowed might be. Anyways, thanks everyone for listening to today's episode. I've been your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.